The smell of synthetic lavender from the cheap floor cleaner collided head-on with the heavy, sweet scent of the white lilies the decorators brought in early this morning. My house, the exact same exposed brick house with the gabled roof that I maintained with my own two hands for the last 3 decades, didn't feel like mine at all anymore. There were strange men dressed in black shirts and immaculate aprons striding across the hallway, carrying silver trays that gleamed under the ceiling lights, boxes full of crystal glasses that clinked with every hurried step, and stainless steel ice buckets that left a trail of condensation on the floor. The noise was constant. It was a hum of foreign voices, orders barked from the backyard, and the dull thud of heavy furniture being dragged across my hardwood floors. The great oak dining table, the one where I served dinner every night for years and where my late husband Tony used to read the Sunday paper, had been shoved carelessly against the back wall to make room for a makeshift dance floor. I stood in the kitchen doorway with my hands clasped in front of me. I felt like a ghost. I felt like an inconvenient obstacle in my own territory, watching in silence as my entire life was hastily covered up by rented linen tablecloths and pretentious centerpieces I never would have picked. I ran my fingertips over the rough fabric of my apron, smoothing out invisible wrinkles over my stomach. It was a mechanical, silent gesture that got stuck in my bones after 40 years working as a bookbinder, smoothing fresh glue over the spines of thousands of heavy volumes. My name is Josephine. I am 68 years old, and my whole life I was firmly convinced that a mother's love was proven by swallowing exhaustion, bowing your head to hardship, and serving as a stone bridge for your children to cross into a better life without ever getting their feet wet. I always believed that caring, protecting, and providing was my only purpose on this earth, the only reason God put air in my lungs every morning, until today. The party wasn't mine, of course. My son Richard had decided that the massive backyard of my property, with its antique rose bushes and the old weeping willow Tony planted when we got married, was the perfect setting to celebrate the 10th anniversary of his law firm. He lived in a hyper-modern, freezing cold apartment downtown. It was a place full of mirrors and designer furniture where you couldn't fit more than 10 people without suffocating. So, as was his custom ever since he became a successful corporate lawyer, he disposed of my home as if it were a free event hall, assuming I would be thrilled to give up my space for his benefit. I had spent the entire week pruning the plants, waxing the hardwood floors until my knees ached, and cleaning every single window so he could show off in front of his partners and his wife Natalie's parents. Natalie walked past me right then. She left a trail of incredibly expensive perfume that turned my stomach. She wore an emerald silk dress that clung perfectly to her thin frame, and high heels that clicked with absolute authority against my floor tiles. She didn't even look me in the eye. She stopped in front of a floral arrangement resting on the hallway console and clicked her tongue in annoyance, nudging a lily a fraction of an inch to the left with the tip of her perfectly manicured nail. "Richard," she called out, using that sharp nasal voice she always pulled out when something bothered her. "Tell the waiters not to pour the red wine until the senior partners get here. And please, do something about the stale smell in this house. It's giving me a migraine." Richard appeared from the residential hallway. He was wearing an immaculate navy blue tailored suit and a wristwatch that cost more than I made in an entire year sewing the spines of encyclopedias. He looked handsome. He was tall, with the same square jaw as his father, but with a cold, calculating look in his eyes that Tony never had. When he saw me standing in the kitchen, in my simple cotton dress and checkered apron, his expression tightened. He walked toward me with quick steps, glancing sideways at the front door, acting as if he was terrified someone important might walk in that exact second and catch me there. "Mom, what are you doing standing right in the way?" he asked in a harsh whisper. He grabbed my elbow with a firmness that actually hurt a little, pushing me slightly toward the dark corner next to the refrigerator. "I just wanted to help arrange the appetizer trays, sweetheart," I replied quietly, trying to smile. I was trying to find the little boy I used to make after-school snacks for in his eyes. The catering boys seem a little disorganized. I thought I could— No, leave it. The waiters know exactly what they are doing. That is why I am paying them a fortune," he interrupted, letting go of my elbow and running a hand through his slicked back hair. "Listen to me, Mom. Tonight is a crucial night for my career. The senior partners of the firm are coming. Natalie's parents are coming. Very important people are coming, people who are not used to this kind of environment. I didn't understand what he meant by this kind of environment. My house was humble, yes, but it was spotless. I had just painted the walls myself. The cushions were washed, the floors shined. I looked at him in total confusion, waiting for him to finish the sentence. He sighed. It was a heavy sound, loaded with irritation, as if speaking to me was an exhausting chore that drained his life force. He looked at Natalie, who gave a slight, dismissive nod and a crooked smile from across the living room, and then he locked his eyes back on me. "Mom, wash the bathrooms and stay in your room. You are embarrassing us," Richard said. The words left his mouth with a terrifying naturalness. There was no tremor in his voice, no hint of hesitation. They were delivered with the exact same absolute coldness a boss uses to fire an incompetent employee. "You can't be walking around out here in those old lady clothes with that maid attitude, offering people food like you are the cook. Scrub the guest bathrooms. Make sure there is toilet paper and soap, and then lock yourself in your room. I will have one of the waiters bring you a plate of food later. Do not come out until everyone is gone." The silence that followed that order was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my entire life. I felt like the air in the kitchen had turned to solid lead, crushing my lungs, stopping me from taking a single breath of oxygen. I blinked slowly, staring at the face of my only child. I searched his features for any sign of regret, any clue that the words had just slipped out because of the stress of the event. But there was nothing. There was only a cold impatience, a genuine annoyance at my very existence. I was a stain on his perfect painting. I was a living reminder of his humble origins, a reality he desperately needed to hide behind a closed door. I didn't scream. I didn't slap him. I didn't break down sobbing in front of him, and I didn't demand an apology. Over the course of my life, I learned that the deepest wounds do not make you scream right away. They paralyze you. They leave you totally numb while the blood begins to pool in silence. I looked down at his Italian leather shoes, the ones shining under the fluorescent kitchen light. I nodded my head in a slow, mechanical motion. "All right, son," I murmured. My voice sounded dry, completely drained of any recognizable emotion. I turned around and walked toward the laundry room, dragging my feet just a little. Behind me, I heard Richard let out a sigh of relief. I heard him tell Natalie that everything was handled, that the old woman wasn't going to be a bother anymore. Their muffled laughter blended into the soft jazz music the sound technicians had just queued up in the backyard. The air in the laundry room was freezing. I grabbed the worn yellow plastic bucket, the same bucket I had used for the last decade. I pulled out the green sponge, the bottle of pungent bleach, the stiff bristled brush for the tile grout, and a clean microfiber cloth for the mirrors. The weight of the bucket in my hand felt different today. It was no longer the tool of a woman caring for her nest. It was the shackle they had locked onto me in my own home. I walked down the back hallway, avoiding the main living room where the guests were already starting to arrive, and slipped into the guest bathroom. I flipped on the white light and dropped to my knees on the cold ceramic tiles. I poured a splash of bleach into the toilet bowl and started scrubbing with the brush. The caustic chemical smell burned my nostrils a little, but I was grateful for it. It helped me keep my eyes dry. I scrubbed the porcelain until my knuckles turned white. Every circular motion of my arm was a dull strike against my own memory. As I ran the damp sponge along the edge of the sink, my mind traveled back in time without asking permission. The intense smell of chlorine suddenly vanished, replaced by the sharp memory of industrial glue and old paper. It was the winter of 1998. Tony had died of a massive heart attack barely a year earlier. He left us with a minuscule life insurance policy that barely covered the funeral costs and the overdue bills. Richard was 15 years old. He was right in the middle of his teenage years, furious at the world, and desperate to fit in with the kids at the private prep school I insisted on sending him to, believing education was his only lifeline. That winter, his class organized a ski trip up north. It was an incredibly expensive trip, and all his rich friends had already paid for it. Richard came home crying tears of absolute rage. He kicked the doors. He screamed that he was starving, that his life was total misery. I couldn't stand seeing him suffer. That very same week, I took on a monumental commission from a local print shop that was drowning in backlogged work. I had to hand bind, stitch, and glue 200 legal encyclopedias in 4 days. I set up my workspace in our damp, freezing garage. I worked for 72 hours straight without sleeping. I remember the stabbing pain at the base of my neck, like someone had driven a steel awl right into my spine. I remember how the thick hemp thread sliced through the skin of my index fingers and thumbs, leaving bloody grooves that I had to wrap in duct tape just so I wouldn't stain the white pages of the books. I survived on black coffee and stale bread. When I finally delivered the order and took the manila envelope full of cash, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the bills. I came home that night and placed the envelope right on Richard's bed. I told him to pack his bags, that he was going skiing with his friends. He snatched the money with a ravenous speed. He didn't hug me. He didn't ask why my hands were taped up or why my eyes were bloodshot from severe sleep deprivation. He just counted the bills, smiled with total smugness, and ran to the phone to call his buddies. Back then, my mother's heart justified his selfishness. I told myself he was just a boy, that the joy on his face was worth every cut on my fingers, every hour of sheer agony in that freezing garage. But right now, kneeling in front of this toilet, cleaning the imaginary dirt off an already spotless bathroom, the memory didn't make me feel tender. It made me nauseous. I stood up slowly, feeling the familiar cracking in my tired knees, and positioned myself in front of the sink mirror. I took the microfiber cloth, sprayed some glass cleaner, and wiped the mirror until every last speck of dust was gone. Then, I stopped and looked at myself. I saw my gray hair, pulled back into a strict bun that was already showing rebellious strands. I saw the deep wrinkles around my mouth, trenches dug by years of forced smiles and silenced worries. I saw my hands resting on the edge of the marble, rough hands, deformed by early arthritis, marked by old scars from paper cuts and hot glue burns. Those were the hands that had built the man who was currently outside, drinking French champagne and feeling utterly ashamed of me. I picked up the bucket and walked toward the master bathroom, the one attached to my own bedroom, the exact place where I had been ordered to lock myself away. I walked in and shut the door behind me. Outside, the party was in full swing. I could hear the booming laughter of the businessmen, the constant clinking of glasses toasting, Natalie's seductive voice flattering the partners' wives. It all sounded like success, like wealth, like triumph, a triumph built entirely on my hunched shoulders. I started cleaning the second bathroom. I ran the sponge over the glass shower door, and it was in that precise moment, as the soapy water slid down the transparent glass, that something inside me finally clicked. It wasn't an explosion of anger. It wasn't a fit of blind rage or some melodramatic desire for revenge. It was something much deeper, much quieter, and 1,000 times more dangerous. It was the sound of a steel vault, sealing completely shut. My entire life, I had been a woman of unconditional affection. I was a mother who justified, who forgave, who covered up mistakes with a blanket of infinite patience. I was always on high alert, like a sentry in the night, ready to take the bullets so they wouldn't hit my son. But patience is like water in a well. If you keep drawing from it and it never rains, one day you scrape the bottom, and all you find is dry mud. When I heard Richard's order to hide myself away because I embarrassed him, the well went bone dry. That blind love, that animal instinct to protect my young, no matter the cost, just switched off. I literally felt a cold, anesthetic, comforting chill wrap around my chest. The submissive woman who lowered her head so as not to bother anyone died right there in that bathroom, suffocated by the smell of bleach and ingratitude. In her place stood the owner of the house, a woman who knew exactly what she was worth, and who was no longer willing to bleed a single drop more for someone who treated her like garbage. I finished cleaning. I rinsed the sponge with freezing water until the soap stopped running. I washed my hands meticulously, scrubbing every knuckle, every scar, and dried them on an Egyptian cotton towel that Natalie had bought specifically for the occasion, a towel she had explicitly forbidden me from using. I walked out of the bathroom and into my bedroom. The room was dark, lit only by the flashes of colored lights coming from the backyard, bleeding through the half-closed blinds. The sound of the live jazz band made the window panes vibrate slightly. I stood in the middle of the room and took a deep breath. I had been ordered to stay locked in here like a punished dog until the illustrious guests left. I wasn't going to do that. I walked over to the old oak wardrobe. I opened the heavy doors and pulled out a small brown leather suitcase Tony had given me for our 10th anniversary. A suitcase I hadn't used in 20 years. I opened it on the mattress. With precise movements, without rushing but without stopping, I began to pack my things. I didn't take much. 3 clean blouses, my 2 most comfortable pairs of pants, a thick wool sweater for the cold, my blood pressure medication, a pair of soft-soled shoes, and my toiletries. I didn't pack photographs of Richard. I didn't pack keepsakes from his childhood. All of that belonged to the woman who had just died in the guest bathroom. I zipped the suitcase shut with a sharp sound. Then, I walked over to the nightstand. I unlocked the top drawer and pulled out a thick cardboard folder I kept secured. Inside the folder was a legal-sized manila envelope, sealed and heavy. I held it in my hands for a few seconds, feeling the weight of the paper, the weight of the decisions you make in absolute silence while everyone else thinks you know nothing about how the world works. Richard and Natalie thought I was just an ignorant old woman, a relic from another era who didn't understand the law, property rights, or real estate values. They thought my silence was stupidity. They thought my obedience was ignorance. They were about to discover that a mother's silence isn't always submission. Sometimes, it's just the time it takes to set the board before checkmate. I took the manila envelope and walked out of my room. I moved silently down the service hallway, dodging a waiter who was rushing toward the yard with an ice bucket. I reached the guest bathroom, the exact same one I had scrubbed spotless barely half an hour ago. I walked in, flipped on the light, and placed the manila envelope right dead center on the black marble sink. It was impossible to miss. Next to the envelope, I set down my house keys, every single copy I owned. It was an early gift, a package containing the results of months of quiet paperwork, discreet morning visits to the notary while Richard thought I was at the grocery store, and signatures placed at the bottom of irrevocable legal documents. I walked out of the bathroom and didn't look back. I headed to the kitchen and picked up the landline phone mounted on the wall next to the pantry. I dialed the local cab company, the same one I'd used my whole life. "Good evening, Miss Josephine," came the raspy voice of Manny, the dispatcher who had known me for decades. "You need a car at this hour? Sounds like quite a party over there." "Good evening, Manny. Yes, please. I need a car at the back door of my house, through the service alley, as soon as possible. And please tell the driver not to honk. I wouldn't want to interrupt my son's celebration. Be right there in 10 minutes, ma'am." I hung up the receiver, picked up my brown suitcase and my dark winter coat. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't march out into the yard to make a scene. As I opened the back kitchen door leading out to the dark alley, I heard Richard's voice amplified over a microphone, rising above the music and the murmur of the guests. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," my son said, using a rehearsed tone of fake humility that turned my stomach for the very last time. "This success is not mine alone. It is the result of hard work, of looking toward the future, and of surrounding myself with the right people. People who understand that the past must be left behind in order to build a worthy legacy. I raise a glass to the future of this firm, to my wonderful wife Natalie, and to this beautiful home hosting us today, which represents the standard of excellence we always strive for." I pushed the back door shut. The metal latch clicked with finality, cutting off Richard's voice, severing his arrogant speech as if I had just unplugged a television. The night air in the alley was crisp and clean, completely free from the suffocating smell of lilies and cheap hypocrisy. I walked over the uneven pavement until I reached the curb. The yellow headlights of Manny's cab appeared around the corner. Silent, right on time. The car stopped in front of me. The driver rushed out to open the back door and tossed my small suitcase into the trunk. I slid into the back seat, draping my coat over my knees. I looked out the window at the high brick wall of my property, listening to the distant laughter of the people dancing on the floors I had waxed on my hands and knees. The cab pulled away slowly, rolling off the curb. I closed my eyes. I knew that in a few short hours, when the party ended and my son walked into that bathroom looking for relief, the gift I had left on the marble sink was going to obliterate his paper world with the exact same ease he had just used to try and erase me. The synthetic leather upholstery in Manny's cab was cracked from years under the brutal city sun, but to me, in that exact moment, it felt like the most comfortable seat in the world. The car smelled like fake pine and stale dark tobacco, a rough, honest mixture that helped clear my lungs of the sickly sweet trail of the lilies and Natalie's suffocating perfume. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window and watched the high brick wall of my house, the house that had been mine for over 3 decades, fall behind, swallowed by the shadows of the night. The jazz music, which only seconds ago had been hammering my ears with its pretentious rhythm, faded away completely the moment the cab turned the corner onto the main avenue. Suddenly, the only sound keeping me company was the steady hum of the old engine and the rhythmic slap of the tires against the uneven asphalt. I looked down at my hands resting on the fabric of my dark coat. I could still feel the harsh dryness on my fingertips left by the pure bleach, that caustic chemical smell that burrows under your nails and refuses to wash out no matter how much soap you use. I rubbed my arthritis-warped knuckles, remembering the coldness of the sponge, the stark white porcelain of the toilet bowl, and Richard's voice ordering me to vanish. I didn't feel like crying. It was strange. For years, I had cried over the smallest things. When Richard scraped his knees as a boy, when my husband Tony forgot our anniversary, when the money wouldn't stretch to the end of the month. But right now, facing the absolute ultimate betrayal by my own flesh and blood, my eyes were bone dry. What I felt instead was a razor-sharp mental clarity, cold and precise, like the edge of a steel ruler I used to use in the bindery. "Where to, Miss Josephine?" Manny asked, glancing at me briefly in the rearview mirror. His raspy voice broke the silence of the cabin, but it didn't startle me. He was a prudent man, the kind who knows how to read someone else's silence without asking out-of-line questions. He had seen my small leather suitcase and my stealthy exit through the service alley, but he didn't pass judgment. "Take me to 42 Linden Street, Manny. The red brick building, please," I answered. My voice was serene. Not a single syllable trembled. The cab crossed the city, leaving behind the neighborhoods with tree-lined streets and mansions guarded by private security, driving deeper and deeper into the old downtown. The flickering neon lights of 24-hour pharmacies, the yellow street lamps on the corners, and the pulled-down metal grates of the shops welcomed me back to a world Richard despised, but which I had always found deeply real. We pulled up to a 3-story building with modest architecture and walls weathered by dampness. I paid Manny with exact change from my coat pocket and stepped out before he could even put the car in park to open the door for me. I grabbed my suitcase, gave him a nod of thanks, and waited until the red taillights of the cab disappeared at the end of the street before walking up to the intercom. I pressed the button for the second floor. A few long, heavy seconds passed, where the only sound was the distant bark of a stray dog. Then, a metallic click and a voice, sleepy but alert. "Who is it at this hour?" Martha asked through the static of the speaker. "It's me, Martha. It's Josie. Open the door." The buzzer sounded instantly, a long, harsh drone. I pushed the heavy iron and glass door open, immediately hit by the familiar smell of floor wax and vegetable soup that always coated the hallway of this building. I walked up the stairs slowly, leaning all my weight on the wooden handrail, making sure my knees wouldn't give out. Martha was waiting for me on the second-floor landing. She was wearing a plaid flannel robe over her cotton nightgown, and her reading glasses hung from a gold chain over her chest. Martha had been a literature teacher for 40 years. We had known each other since we were young women, back when we both counted out pennies just to buy fresh bread. She was never a woman for drama or hysterics. Seeing me standing there with my 20-year-old suitcase and a hollow look in my eyes, she didn't throw her hands up to her head or gasp in pity. She just stepped aside and pulled the door open wider. "Come on in, Josie. The water for the tea is almost boiling," was all she said. I walked into her small apartment. It was a space crammed with bookshelves overflowing with novels, indoor plants, and antique furniture that smelled of polished wood and accumulated dust. I dropped my suitcase by the living room sofa and followed her into the kitchen, a tiny nook with yellow tiles and a green formica table. I sat down on one of the metal frame chairs, dropping my arms onto the table, suddenly feeling the sheer physical exhaustion of the entire week slam into my shoulders. Martha turned off the stove, poured hot water into 2 thick ceramic mugs, dropped in 2 chamomile tea bags, and sat down across from me. The hot steam fogged her glasses for a second. "What did that idiot son of yours do this time?" she asked, cutting straight to the bone, folding her hands on the table. I looked her in the eye. There was no pity in her expression, just an old, solitary rage. I took a breath, a deep pull that filled my lungs with the scent of chamomile, and let the unvarnished truth spill out. He threw a party for his firm's anniversary at my house, brought in caterers, decorators, a live jazz band. I spent the entire week cleaning and waxing so everything would be perfect. And when his wife's important guests arrived, he cornered me in the kitchen. He told me I embarrassed them, that my old lady clothes and my maid attitude didn't fit in with his crowd. I paused, running a finger along the rim of the hot mug, feeling the heat bleed into my skin. He ordered me to wash the guest bathrooms, to make sure there was toilet paper and soap, and then to lock myself in my room until everyone left. He promised he'd send a waiter with a plate of food, like I was a dog tied up in the yard. Martha didn't blink. Her jaw tightened so hard I saw the muscles in her neck stand out under her wrinkled skin. "And what did you do, Josie?" "I went to the laundry room. I grabbed the bucket, the bleach, and the sponge. I went into the bathroom and scrubbed the toilet, the tiles, and the mirror, just like the little Lord ordered," I answered with a calmness that surprised even me. "I cleaned until the porcelain shined. Then I went to my room, packed the suitcase, took out an envelope I had locked away, left it dead center on the freshly cleaned sink along with every spare key to the house, and called a cab." Martha raised an eyebrow, processing my words, connecting the pieces of a puzzle she knew better than anyone. A slow, almost imperceptible smile, loaded with dark satisfaction, began to tug at the corner of her mouth. "The envelope?" Martha whispered, leaning forward, dropping her voice as if someone might overhear us. "That envelope? The one we went to set up at Arthur Vance's office 2 months ago?" I nodded, lifting the mug and taking a sip of the boiling tea. "That exact one. The bill of sale and the eviction notice." Richard, in his infinite arrogance as a young, successful corporate lawyer, always took for granted that the house was his guaranteed inheritance. He believed, because it was convenient for him to believe it, that when his father died, the property automatically passed down as half mine, half his. What my son never bothered to look into, because he was too busy looking down his nose at the rest of the world, was that Tony had left us on the verge of absolute ruin. Before he died, my late husband had mortgaged the house down to the foundation to cover gambling debts he hid from us for years. When he passed, the bank was days away from foreclosing on the property. It was me, with my hands shredded by hemp thread and boiling glue, working through the night-binding books for courthouses and law firms, who paid off that mortgage penny by penny. I lifted the lien. I did the legal legwork, at 48 years old, to ensure the property was placed exclusively in my name, totally free of debt and presumed heirs. Richard never knew, because he never cared to ask. To him, I was just the woman who served his soup and ironed his shirts. 3 months ago, a major commercial real estate developer knocked on my door. They wanted to buy my lot, demolish the house, and build a private medical center. They offered me a sum of money I hadn't seen put together in my entire life. At first, I hesitated. I thought about the weeping willow, the rose bushes, the romantic idea of leaving a legacy for my son. But then Richard married Natalie in a luxury civil ceremony, and conveniently forgot to send me an invitation, justifying it later by saying it was an exclusive event for firm partners. Then came the constant slights, the mocking of my old furniture, the times he pretended not to know me when I went to his office to drop off paperwork. 2 months ago, I called Arthur Vance, our old estate attorney, and signed the papers. I sold the house. I sold the whole thing, yard, weeping willow, and rose bushes included. The new owners, the developers, take official possession of the property this coming Monday at 8 a.m., I told Martha, setting the empty mug down on the table. The contract stipulates the house must be delivered completely vacant. Inside that envelope I left on the bathroom sink is a certified copy of the deed transferred to Horizon Development Group, along with a notarized letter demanding the occupants remove any personal property before Monday, with the explicit warning that the demolition crew will throw anything left behind into the dumpsters. Martha let out a sharp bark of laughter. It was a harsh sound that bounced off the yellow kitchen tiles. She took off her glasses, wiping away a tear of pure amusement, that had escaped the corner of her eye. Josie, God forgive me, but you are a brilliant woman. You sent him to clean up his own remains, Martha said, shaking her head. That miserable bastard must be toasting with champagne right now, showing off his big house, completely clueless that he is standing on dirt that belongs to a corporate conglomerate. He asked me to clear the path, so I wouldn't embarrass him, I replied, finally feeling the tension leave my muscles, making way for a deep, restorative fatigue. I just cleared the whole damn path for him. He no longer has a mother to embarrass him, nor a house to show off. I slept in Martha's guest room that night. The bed was narrow and the mattress a bit stiff, but I closed my eyes and fell into a heavy, profound sleep. No nightmares, no tossing and turning. I didn't hear jazz music, or clinking glasses, or arrogant voices barking orders. I only heard the protective silence of a home where no one judged me. The next morning, I woke up early, long before the sun managed to fully bleed through the wooden blinds. I got up, splashed cold water on my face in Martha's modest bathroom, and got dressed in my thick slacks and wool sweater. Martha had left a thermos of hot coffee and some toast on the kitchen table before heading out for her morning errands. I ate breakfast in silence, chewing slowly, organizing the steps I needed to take today. I couldn't just sit on my hands waiting for the explosion. I had to secure the perimeter. At exactly 9 a.m., I walked out of Martha's building and walked the 6 blocks to Arthur Vance's office. The morning air was biting, cutting, but it felt good against my face. The city was already awake, full of rushing office workers, street vendors setting up their carts, and the deafening screech of city buses braking at the corners. I walked into the old building where the law firm was located. High ceilings, black and white checkerboard marble floors, solid oak doors. Vance's secretary, a kind woman who knew me very well, waved me right through without making me wait in the reception area. Arthur Vance's office smelled of old paper, ink pads, and the pipe tobacco he smoked when his wife wasn't around. Arthur was sitting behind a massive desk, reviewing some case files. When he saw me walk in, he stood up with a bit of difficulty, leaning heavily on his silver-handled cane, and offered me a warm, deeply respectful smile. "Josie, what an early surprise. Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from his desk. I sat down, keeping my back perfectly straight and my hands resting in my lap. "Good morning, Mr. Vance. I came to confirm that the entire process with Horizon Development Group is closed and ironclad. I need to know there is no going back." Arthur adjusted the glasses on the bridge of his nose. He opened a thick cardboard folder on his desk and pulled out a stack of stamped initialed documents. "Everything is fully executed, Josie. The wire transfer cleared first thing this morning, the second the banks opened. The funds from the total sale are sitting in the new account under your name at the international bank we selected. It is an account that absolutely no one else has access to or legal authorization over. The public deed was filed and sealed at the county clerk's office yesterday afternoon. Legally speaking, the exposed brick house now belongs to the developers. They have the surveyors and the demolition crew scheduled to arrive this Monday, first thing in the morning." I nodded. I felt a wave of absolute peace washing over me as I heard the official words. However, I knew Richard wasn't just going to sit back and take it. I knew my son. I knew his arrogance and his talent for twisting the law in his favor when he felt backed into a corner. Arthur, my son Richard, found the documents last night. I left a copy of the deed and the eviction notice at the house before I left. I informed him, looking him dead in the eye. He is a corporate lawyer. He has a firm full of aggressive partners. What can he do against me? I need the cold, hard facts. Arthur sighed, leaning back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. His expression turned grave, shifting into his legal strategist persona. A lawyer with a bruised ego is a dangerous animal, Josie. Even more so if it's your own son. The very first thing Richard will try to do is contest the sale by claiming senile dementia or mental incompetence on your part. He will claim the developers took advantage of a confused old woman, that you were not in your right mind when you signed the papers. He will try to get a judge to freeze the transaction and declare you legally incompetent so he can seize conservatorship of your assets. It is the dirtiest trick in the book, but it's the most common one in these scenarios. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I reached into my worn black leather purse, unzipped the inner compartment, and pulled out a clear plastic folder. I placed it on Arthur's desk and slid it slowly toward him. Review that, Arthur. He opened the folder. Inside were 3 medical certificates printed on official letterhead. He read the first one, then the second. By the time he got to the third, a smile of pure, authentic admiration lit up his wrinkled face. He let out a short laugh, slapping the desk with the palm of his hand. 3 independent psychiatric and neurological evaluations, Arthur read aloud, thoroughly amazed. One of them signed by the chief of psychiatry at the city clinical hospital, and another by a court-appointed expert, all dated less than 2 weeks ago, certifying your perfect mental lucidity, your completely intact cognitive capacity, and your total fitness to make complex financial decisions. Josie, you are playing chess, while the rest of the world is playing checkers. I bound legal books for 40 years, Mr. Vance, I replied with an icy calm. I know exactly how paper traps are built, and I know how to spring them shut before the enemy even puts his foot inside. Richard cannot declare me crazy. He cannot void the sale. And he cannot fight Horizon Development Group because their corporate sharks would crush him in a week and leave him bankrupt. It is an absolute checkmate, Arthur confirmed, closing the folder and handing it back to me with a look of profound respect. Your son has absolutely zero legal leverage to reverse this. The house is gone, and the money is untouchable. You have total freedom, Josie. I walked out of the law office with the documents safely tucked in my purse, and a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt since I was 20 years old. I walked a couple of blocks to the main city plaza. The sun was high now, warming the gray cobblestones and the wrought iron benches. I bought a black coffee from a corner kiosk. It was cheap coffee, served in a paper cup that burned to the touch. I sat on a bench in front of a stone fountain where pigeons bathed, ignoring the roar of the traffic. I held the cup with both hands, letting the heat soothe the dull ache in my joints. I was watching a little boy throw breadcrumbs to the birds when the cell phone I kept in my coat pocket began to vibrate violently. The generic ringtone shattered the peace of the morning. I pulled the device out. On the bright screen, the name Richard was flashing endlessly. I didn't answer right away. I let the phone ring once, twice, 3, 4 times. I wanted the anxiety of the weight to chew through his nerves. I wanted the silence to weigh as heavily on him as his disdain had weighed on me. Just as the call was about to drop to voicemail, I swiped my finger across the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. Hello, I said. My tone was neutral, almost bored, like I was answering a call from an insurance salesman. Mom, for the love of God, where the hell are you? Richard's voice exploded on the other end of the line. It wasn't the measured, arrogant tone of the successful lawyer giving a speech in the backyard. It was a desperate, furious, choked hiss, like he was locked in a small room so no one would hear him screaming. He was probably hiding in the exact same bathroom I had scrubbed. I'm drinking a coffee in the sun, Richard. It's a beautiful morning, I replied, taking a sip from my paper cup. I heard his ragged breathing through the receiver. I heard the sound of paper being violently crumpled. What is this piece of garbage you left on the sink? He demanded, spitting the words out. What does this fake contract mean, Mom? Tell me this is a sick joke. Tell me this is just some crazy stunt because you were mad. Natalie is hysterical. Her parents just left, totally offended because the party was ruined when I disappeared. What did you do? It is not a fake contract, son. It is a certified copy from the notary, I answered, enunciating every syllable with piercing clarity. The original is properly filed with the county clerk's office, and it means exactly what you read on the first page. I sold the house, the whole house, the land, the walls, the roof, and your beautiful backyard with the weeping willow. It doesn't belong to me anymore. You can't do that, Richard screamed, completely losing control of his volume. That house was mine too. It was my inheritance from Dad. You had no right to sell it without my signature. I am going to sue you. I am taking you to court. I am going to have this scam annulled. The sound of his desperation crashed against the shield of my meticulous preparation and shattered into a million pieces. Your father didn't leave an inheritance, Richard. He left gambling debts and a mortgage that was 1 month away from foreclosure, I said, dropping my voice into a cutting, authoritative whisper. I paid for that house with my bare hands, binding books at 3 in the morning while you were sleeping and going on ski trips. That property has been in my name, and only my name, for 15 years. You never found out because you were too busy being ashamed of my old skirts to bother checking the public records. There was a dead silence on the other end of the line, the crushing weight of legal truth, a truth his lawyer brain had just processed and validated in a fraction of a second, dropped on him like a slab of concrete. Mom! His voice changed. The fury vanished, replaced by a wet, trembling waver. The tremor of a man who looks over the edge of a cliff and realizes he isn't wearing a parachute. Mom, please, listen to me. You can't do this to me. The buyer is Horizon Development Group. They're the biggest commercial conglomerate in the state. My firm can't fight them. They'd rip me to shreds in a hearing. I spent all my savings remodeling the yard and paying for this party. The eviction notice says they're coming to take possession on Monday. That's in 2 days. I have designer furniture in there. The band left their sound equipment. Natalie's parents left their cars in the garage. I have nowhere to put all this stuff. I took another sip of coffee. I watched the pigeons pecking at the ground. I felt the sun warming my face. I remembered the humiliation, the searing pain in my knees scrubbing the white ceramic tiles, the absolute disgust in Natalie's eyes, the cruel order from my own son pushing me into the shadows of my own home. You told me to wash the bathrooms and go hide because I embarrassed you, Richard, I said, my voice so serene it seemed to float in the air. I already did. I cleaned up the dirt, I packed my suitcase, and I hid myself from your life forever. Now it's your turn to clean up the mess. You have until Monday at 8 a.m. to get your things out, or the developers' bulldozers are going to crush your designer furniture right along with the old house that embarrassed you so much. Mom, wait. Please, don't hang up. We need to talk. I didn't mean... Goodbye, Richard. Close the door on your way out. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. The call cut off abruptly, silencing his begging. I stared at the black screen for a few seconds. Then, with a firm flick of my work-deformed fingers, I popped off the plastic case, opened the side slot, pulled out the SIM card, and snapped it in half with my thumbnail. The tiny piece of plastic and metal fell to the ground, lost among the gray cobblestones of the plaza. I looked up, breathed in the cold morning air, and finished my black coffee in silence, knowing that the board was now locked. There was no going back. The broken piece of plastic lay abandoned among the gray tiles of the plaza, blending in with the urban grime and the dry leaves the wind dragged across the ground. I shoved the dead phone deep into my black leather purse, zipped it shut with a sharp click, and stood up. The mid-morning sun had already warmed the stone bench, but I felt an unusual coolness in my body. For the first time in 40-something years, I didn't have to rush to a grocery store to hunt down the cheapest vegetables, or hurry back to a house to wax floors, or calculate how many books I needed to stitch that week to keep the lights on. My time, suddenly, belonged entirely to me. I walked with a steady pace down the main avenue of the financial district. The buildings around me were massive blocks of tempered glass and steel, cold, gigantic structures reflecting the gray clouds above. On the sidewalk, young men and women in tailored suits, carrying leather briefcases, power-walked past, frowning into their phones, trapped in the exact same bubble of urgency and arrogance my son lived in. None of them looked twice at me. To them, I was just an old woman in a thick sweater and orthopedic shoes, a nuisance walking too slowly, an invisible shadow against the backdrop of their success. I stepped aside slightly to let a group of executives pass and kept walking until I reached the main branch of the International Bank of Commerce, the place Arthur Vance had instructed me to open my new account. I pushed through the heavy revolving door, and the air conditioning hit my face like an icy gust of wind. The inside of the bank was cavernous, lined in white marble, with towering ceilings displaying geometric designer chandeliers. There were no long lines of people waiting to cash a miserable pension check. There were no grumpy tellers sitting behind smudged glass. This was the bank where real money moved, the kind of money that buys silence and builds skyscrapers. I walked up to the receptionist's desk, a young woman in an immaculate tailored suit with her hair pulled back into a tight bun. "Good morning?" I have an appointment with the Director of Wealth Management, Miss Valerie Rivers. I am Josephine Salazar, I said, resting my arthritis-warped hands on the polished granite counter. The young woman typed something into her computer, looked up at me with a mix of surprise and professional courtesy, and nodded immediately. She asked me to take a seat on one of the white leather sofas, but I barely had time to settle in before a tall woman in her 50s, wearing thin-rimmed glasses and an expression of razor-sharp intelligence, walked over to me. "Mrs. Salazar, what a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Valerie Rivers. Please come with me to my office," the director said, extending a firm hand that I shook without hesitation. Valerie's office was on the 3rd floor, completely insulated from the noise of the lobby by heavy acoustic wood doors. I sat down across from her perfectly organized desk. Valerie opened a leather folder and pulled out a stack of documents printed on heavy stock paper. Mr. Vance informed me first thing this morning that the real estate transaction with Horizon Development Group was successfully finalized. The funds were released early this morning, Mrs. Salazar. The money from the total sale is now sitting in the account under your name. Valerie handed me a printed bank statement. I took the paper. The number printed on the available balance line had so many zeros that for a split second my vision blurred. That number wasn't just money. It was the exact monetary value of my blood, of my sleepless nights, of my destroyed knees scrubbing tiles, and the skin of my hands sliced open by hemp thread. It was the price of my freedom. "Ms. Rivers, I didn't come here just to look at a piece of paper," I said, handing the document back to her and locking my eyes onto hers. "I came to bulletproof this money. My son is a corporate lawyer. He has resources, he has connections, and he has enough arrogance to try any legal maneuver in the book. Mr. Vance and I already slammed the door shut on the medical and notary side, but I need to make absolutely certain that if Richard finds a loophole in the system and tries to freeze my assets, he crashes straight into a concrete wall." Valerie Rivers looked at me with a new intensity. She was no longer evaluating me as a lucky old woman, but as a strategist speaking her native language. She took off her glasses, set them on the desk, and nodded slowly. "I completely understand your concern, Mrs. Salazar. And you are right. Preventative asset freezes are the weapon of choice in family disputes. To prevent that, we cannot leave the money in a standard savings account. What we are going to do today is establish an irrevocable blind trust, domiciled in an international jurisdiction with which our bank holds direct agreements. You will be the sole living beneficiary, but legally, the assets will no longer be held directly under your name domestically. If your son tries to trace your accounts or file for a preventative injunction in this state, the system will return a balance of 0. There will be absolutely nothing to freeze, nothing to seize. You will receive a debit card with no geographic limits, and you can access the funds whenever you wish, but legally speaking, the money will be untouchable by third parties." "How long does it take to sign that?" I asked. I felt a profound wave of relief, as if a backpack full of rocks had just been lifted off my spine. "The contracts have already been drafted per Mr. Vance's request. He warned me about your proactive nature. I just need your signature on 10 pages and your thumbprint. Within 48 hours, the legal structure will be fully operational offshore, and the funds will be transferred." I spent the next half hour reading every single clause, every line of fine print in the documents Valerie placed in front of me. My eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but my years binding civil codes and criminal dossiers had taught me exactly how to spot traps in contract phrasing. There were none. I signed with a steady hand. When I put the pen down, Valerie handed me a sleek black card. It didn't have my name printed on it, just a series of silver numbers. "This is your key, Mrs. Salazar. No one else in the world has access to it." I walked out of the bank just past 11 in the morning. The air felt different, purer, lighter. I walked several blocks away from the financial district, slowly drifting into the older streets of the city, the ones where faded canvas awnings shielded the windows of small, family-owned shops. I needed a new phone. I walked into a neighborhood electronics store, a narrow place smelling of dust and fresh plastic, and bought the simplest device they had. A big button phone with no internet access, just for making and receiving calls. I bought a new number and slipped it into my coat pocket. As I was walking back toward Martha's apartment, I passed by an old hardware store. The harsh smell of sawdust, fresh paint, and industrial glue drifted out onto the sidewalk. I stopped dead in my tracks. That smell, that heavy, chemical mixture forced its way up my nose and violently dragged me back to the past, stealing my breath for a second. It was as if the street evaporated, and I was back in the damp garage of my old house, 20 years ago. Tony had just died. I was devastated, not just by the loss of the man I had shared my life with, but by the Pandora's box that ripped open when the bank came knocking. Tony was never a bad man in a violent sense, but he was a coward with destructive vices. He played cards, he bet on the ponies, he took out loans from loan sharks behind my back. When his heart failed, he left me standing alone on the edge of an abyss. I remembered the men in cheap suits and hard eyes who showed up at the house one rainy afternoon, demanding payment on promissory notes I had never seen before. I remembered the suffocating terror of losing the roof over my 15-year-old son's head. I never told Richard anything. I swallowed the terror, hid the bank notices, and pretended that the grueling hours in the garage binding books were just a way to keep my mind busy while grieving. I shielded him from poverty. I shielded him from the truth about his father. I shielded him from the humiliation of knowing we were one step away from the street. Thinking I was doing him a favor, I built him a padded reality where he never had to worry about the price of bread or the threat of the power getting cut. And that was my curse. By shielding him from suffering, I raised a blind man. I raised an individual, completely incapable of valuing sacrifice. An arrogant man who believed the entire world owed him homage simply for existing. The smell of glue from the hardware store didn't make me sad anymore. It made me furious. Furious at myself for being so naive, and filled with an icy determination to never, ever make the same mistake again. I got back to the red brick building just past 1 in the afternoon. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the accumulated exhaustion of the morning in the backs of my knees. When I reached the second floor, I found Martha's apartment door cracked open. I pushed the wood and walked in. The smell of vegetable soup flooded the hallway, a homely, comforting aroma. Martha was in the kitchen with the landline phone wedged between her ear and her shoulder, stirring an aluminum pot with a wooden spoon. When she saw me walk in, she waved her free hand, motioning for me to sit at the green formica table. "Yes, Carmen, I hear you. No, don't worry, I won't tell a soul." "Uh-huh. And what did they do? You don't say." "Well, girl, I have to go. The soup is boiling over. Hugs, take care." Martha slammed the receiver down, let out a raspy laugh, and dropped into the chair across from me, wiping her hands on her checkered apron. "Oh, Josie, the whole neighborhood is talking. Mrs. Carmichael just called. The widow who lives next door to your house, the one with the vines on the property line. I imagine she didn't sleep because of the jazz band," I said, pulling out my new phone and setting it on the table. The jazz band was the least of it. Martha leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Carmen told me the party came to a dead stop around 2 a.m. She says she heard a scream, but not a happy scream, a roar of absolute fury coming from inside the house. Shortly after, the backyard lights cut out and the guests started leaving. Carmen was spying through the blinds, of course. She says she saw your son's wife's parents storm out, faces dragging on the ground, getting into their imported car without saying goodbye to anyone." I nodded slowly. Richard had walked into the bathroom. He had seen the envelope, read the document, and his cardboard theater had collapsed right in front of his in-laws. "But that isn't the best part," Martha continued, ladling steaming soup into 2 deep bowls. "Carmen says that first thing this morning, before the stores even opened, a moving truck pulled up to the front of your old house. 2 guys in overalls got out and rang the bell. Your son came out in his bathrobe, completely unhinged, screaming at the top of his lungs in the middle of the street that he hadn't ordered any movers and to get off his property. The movers didn't even flinch. They showed him a piece of paper. They told him they had been hired and paid in advance by Mrs. Salazar to clear out the residence, and that if he didn't let them in, his problem was going to be with the demolition company on Monday morning." Ein smiled, picking up my metal spoon. I had tied up every single loose end. Not only did I sell the property and sign the eviction notice, I used a tiny fraction of the contract deposit to hire the most efficient, ruthless moving company in the city. What did Richard do? I asked, blowing on the hot broth. According to Carmen, the coward started threatening to call the cops. The movers just laughed in his face. They dumped a stack of empty cardboard boxes on the sidewalk and drove off. Your son just stood there on the curb, in his bathrobe, in front of all the neighbors coming out to buy the morning paper, staring at the boxes like they were coffins. Carmen says the wife, that Natalie girl, came out onto the porch crying, screaming that he was a useless piece of trash, asking how it was possible he had no control over his own house. The soup tasted delicious, but the poetic justice Martha was feeding me nourished a part of my soul that had been starving for years. Richard was experiencing, for the very first time in his life, what it felt like to be publicly humiliated, stripped of his dignity in front of the exact people he was trying hardest to impress. We finished eating in a conspiratorial silence. Martha gathered the bowls, and I was getting ready to help her wash up when a sharp, piercing sound shattered the calm of the apartment. It wasn't my new phone. It was the building's buzzer, the intercom ringing from the street. Martha frowned. I'm not expecting anyone. Mailman, maybe? She walked into the hallway and picked up the intercom receiver. Yes? Who is it? Martha went dead silent for a few seconds. Her back tensed up. She turned her head toward me, covering the mouthpiece with the palm of her hand. Josie, it's a man. He's asking for you. He says he's from your son's law firm, and he needs to serve you with an urgent notice. My stomach knotted up for a fraction of a second, but the icy chill of the bleach, that wall of ice I had built in my chest the night before, smothered any trace of fear. Richard had tracked me down. He probably used his firm's connections to find out which cab company dispatched the car to the service alley and forced Manny or the dispatcher to give up my drop-off address. It was a desperate move, the flailing of a drowning man. Let him up, Martha, I said, wiping my hands on a dish towel, and leave the door cracked open. Martha nodded, pressed the button to release the street gate, and left her apartment door ajar. I sat down on the armchair in the small living room, back straight, hands folded in my lap, eyes locked on the doorway. I wasn't going to hide in the kitchen. I wasn't going to lower my head. I heard the fast, heavy footsteps charging up the stairs. Seconds later, the door swung all the way open. Standing in the doorway was a young man, no older than 30, wearing a light gray suit, a silk tie, and holding a dark leather briefcase in his right hand. He had slicked back hair and the haughty expression of someone who believes a college degree makes them bulletproof. I recognized him instantly. It was Mr. Miller, one of the junior partners at Richard's firm, a kid who used to look at me with absolute disdain whenever I brought lunch to my son at the office. Miller walked in without asking permission. He looked at Martha's old furniture with a grimace of obvious disgust until his eyes locked onto me. Mrs. Salazar, he said. He used an authoritative, artificial tone, trying to project a commanding presence that was way out of his league. Your son sent me on behalf of the firm. It took me all morning to track you down in this place. You found me, Mr. Miller, so say whatever it is you came to say and leave quickly. We are busy washing dishes, I replied. I didn't raise my voice, but the firmness of it made him blink in confusion. He was used to the submissive Josephine who looked at the floor. Miller cleared his throat, popped open his briefcase, and pulled out a white envelope bearing the law firm's letterhead. I am serving you with an extrajudicial demand, Mrs. Salazar. Richard is willing to be lenient. If you sign this document, retracting the sale and declaring that you signed the papers under a state of severe mental confusion induced by medication, the firm will handle fighting the contract's nullity with Horizon Development. Richard will assume your legal guardianship, and we will place you in a private assisted living facility, all expenses paid. But if you refuse, Miller took a step forward, trying to use his height to intimidate me. If you refuse, we will file a criminal complaint for procedural fraud, first thing tomorrow morning. We will have you arrested, ma'am. It is not in your best interest to fight us. Richard is furious, and when Richard gets mad, he destroys whoever stands in his way. Martha, standing by the kitchen frame, let out a snort of pure contempt, but I raised a hand to ask for her silence. I stood up slowly. My knees popped, but my posture was as straight as a ship's mast. I walked right up to the young lawyer until I was mere inches from his chest. He was taller, but a height advantage is completely useless when there is zero fear in your opponent's eyes. "Mr. Miller," I said, my voice soft, slicing like the edge of a piece of paper, "you are a very young boy, so I am going to give you some free advice before you ruin your career. That piece of paper in your hand holds absolutely zero legal weight. It is a cheap intimidation tactic that would scare an ignorant old woman, but not me." Miller frowned, gripping the white envelope. "Ma'am, this is a serious procedure. Silence. I cut him off with a dryness that made him swallow hard. "I suggest you call your boss, Richard, right this exact second. Tell him, from me, that this morning I visited the office of Arthur Vance. Tell him that the 3 medical certificates, endorsed by court-appointed psychiatric experts, certifying my perfect mental lucidity, are already attached to the sale file. Tell him the funds have already been transferred into an untouchable international blind trust. And tell him, above all else, that if he files a false criminal complaint alleging fraud, Arthur Vance will file a countersuit for extortion and ideological forgery against his firm, and demand the disbarment of your professional licenses." All the color drained from Miller's face. His tanning bed glow turned a sickly gray. His mouth opened slightly, but the legal threats were stuck in his throat. He knew exactly who Arthur Vance was. Every lawyer in the city knew Vance was an institution, a man who did not lose cases, and who absolutely despised the dirty tricks of modern law firms. "You have nothing, boy," I continued, dropping my voice to a whisper that filled the room with suffocating tension. "Richard sent you to fight a war he lost months ago. The house is the private property of a corporate group. Tomorrow is Sunday. Monday at 8 a.m., the bulldozers are coming to knock down the walls. If you or my son's designer furniture are inside, it will be the police's problem to drag you out for trespassing." Miller took a step back, slowly lowering the white envelope as if it had suddenly caught fire in his hands. He looked at Martha, then at me. He awkwardly snapped his briefcase shut and backed toward the door without saying another word. His arrogance had completely crumbled in under 3 minutes. He stepped out into the hallway and practically ran down the stairs, stumbling over the steps in his desperation to escape the trap his boss had thrown him into. Martha slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the deadbolt. She looked at me from the other side of the living room, arms crossed, a smile of pure admiration blooming on her wrinkled lips. "Josie, if I had known you had this kind of fire hiding inside you, I would have brought you in to teach my worst high school students," Martha said, shaking her head. I sat back down in the armchair. My heart was pounding, but with a steady, powerful rhythm. I pulled my new phone out of my pocket and stared at the blank screen. Richard's assault had failed. His attempts to intimidate me with expensive suited errand boys had crashed headfirst into a wall of medical and legal evidence I had prepared in total silence while he treated me like a nuisance. There were no more threats that could scare me. The trust protected my future. The notary protected my sanity in the eyes of the law. And the contract with Horizon Development Group would execute the sentence I had handed down. All that was left was to wait for the weekend to end. Monday morning, the developers would take possession of the bricks, the waxed hardwood, and the pretentious backyard, and I would make sure, from the shadows, that Richard understood the exact price of ordering me to scrub those bathrooms. Sunday passed with the thick sluggishness of the hours, just before an unavoidable storm. Martha's apartment, usually filled with the classical music she played on her old transistor radio, remained wrapped in a dense, expectant silence. I spent most of the afternoon sitting by the small living room window, watching the traffic on the main avenue through the drizzle-fogged glass. I didn't feel anxious. Anxiety is the fear of the unknown, the uncertainty of what fate might throw in your face. I had no uncertainties. I had drawn the blueprints myself, tightened the bolts, and lit the fuse. The only thing standing between me and the final explosion was the simple passage of time. Martha brewed lemon verbena tea and baked oatmeal cookies, moving around her kitchen with a tranquility I felt grateful for in my soul. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She didn't try to convince me to show mercy, nor did she resort to that common emotional blackmail dictating that a mother must forgive any atrocity simply because she gave birth to her executioner. She knew better than anyone that there are wounds that don't bleed, but instead rot the wood from the inside out, until the entire structure collapses. When night fell, I retreated to the guest room. I turned on the small nightstand lamp, its yellowish light casting long shadows against the floral wallpaper. I opened my brown leather suitcase on the bed to pick out my clothes for the next day. As I pushed my clean blouses aside, my fingers brushed against the fabric-lined bottom of the suitcase and hit a small, hard, rectangular object. I pulled it out slowly. It was a dark blue velvet case, worn around the edges. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. The brush of the velvet against my fingertips triggered a spring in my memory, a sharp blow that dragged me 10 years into the past, to the day Richard first showed me the razor edge of his true nature. It was his law school graduation ceremony, December 2012. It was suffocatingly hot in the city, one of those days where the asphalt seems to melt under your shoes. I had spent the previous 3 months working double shifts at the bindery, wrecking my cervical spine over the cutting table, breathing in paper dust and industrial glue until my nose bled. Every bit of that extra money, every single coin saved in a glass jar hidden in the pantry, went toward buying his graduation gift. A name-brand fountain pen, gold-plated, engraved with his initials. It was an absurd luxury, something I never would have bought for myself. But I wanted my son to hold a symbol of power in his hands when he stepped into the world of tailored suits and courthouses. I wanted him to feel equal to the sons of judges and bankers he had studied with. The ceremony took place in the university's Hall of Honor. It was a massive room paneled in walnut wood, with red velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers pouring warm light over the crowd. I wore my best dress, a beige linen suit I had washed and starched the night before, and freshly polished low-heeled shoes. I stayed at the back of the hall, near the double doors, gripping the blue velvet case inside my purse so tightly my knuckles ached. Richard was in the front row, glowing in his black gown, receiving his diploma with a smug smile that lit up his face. When the ceremony ended and the celebratory cocktail hour began, I pushed my way through the crowd of wealthy families. I dodged trays of canapes and champagne flutes, looking for my son to hand him his gift and give him a hug. I found him near the large windows overlooking the central courtyard. He wasn't alone. He was chatting animatedly with Mr. Ignatius Montez, one of the founding partners of the most prestigious law firm in the city, a man Richard idolized and desperately wanted to work for. I approached with quick steps, my heart beating in my throat with pride, ready to introduce myself. I stopped a few feet away, partially hidden by a marble column, waiting for the right moment to interrupt. That was when I heard the deep, educated voice of Mr. Montez. "It is an impeccable academic record, Richard. You have the makings of a litigator. Did your family come to support you today? I would love to meet your parents and congratulate them. Raising a young man with your level of ambition is no easy task." My son's response wasn't immediate. There was a pause, a silence of barely 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity suspended in the hot air of the hall. Richard glanced sideways at the crowd. He smoothed the lapel of his new suit, the exact suit I had paid for, and adopted an expression of calculated melancholy. "I am completely alone, sir," Richard replied. His voice was steady, utterly devoid of hesitation. "My father passed away when I was just a teenager. He left me a small inheritance that I managed strictly to pay for my studies. And my mother couldn't bear the grief of widowhood and passed away shortly after. I have no family. I built myself from the ground up. I have no emotional distractions or ties that would prevent me from dedicating my entire life to the profession." The air vanished from my lungs. The chatter of the grand hall, the clinking of crystal glasses, the laughter of the graduates, everything faded away, drowned out by a high-pitched, deafening ringing that drilled into my ears. I stood frozen behind the marble column, staring at the profile of my only child, the little boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the teenager for whom I had shredded my hands sewing books in a freezing garage. He had just killed me. He had buried me alive in the middle of a crowded room, with terrifying ease, all just to impress a businessman, to sell the image of the tragic, self-made orphan. To him, a blue-collar mother, with scar-covered hands and cheap shoes, was an unacceptable liability on his resume. It was better to declare me dead than to introduce me alive. I didn't scream. I didn't step out from behind the column to unmask him in front of his idol. The impulsive, passionate Josephine died a little bit right in that moment. I walked backward, slowly, feeling the marble floor swaying beneath my feet. I made it to one of the long tables where the waiters had stacked empty appetizer trays. I pulled the blue velvet case out of my purse, set it down on the white tablecloth right next to a pile of dirty napkins, and walked out of the Hall of Honor. I walked 20 blocks under the blistering December sun until I got to my house, the house I had just sold, and locked myself in the kitchen, washing clean dishes until my hands bled. When Richard came home that night, bragging that he had been offered a junior associate position at the firm, I didn't ask him anything. And he never mentioned my absence at the ceremony. That was the true beginning of the end. The order to lock myself in the guest bathroom 2 nights ago wasn't a sudden outburst on his part. It was simply the physical manifestation of a death he had already decreed in his mind a decade earlier. I blinked, bringing my mind back to Martha's guest room. The blue velvet case I was holding in my hand was empty. The pen had been left on that cocktail table, but I had kept the box as a reminder. I snapped it shut with a dry click, shoved it to the bottom of my suitcase, and got into bed. Tomorrow, Monday, at 8 a.m., the ghost Richard invented 10 years ago was going to rise from the grave and tear down his castle. I woke up at 5 a.m., long before the alarm went off. The air slipping through the crack in the window was freezing, signaling a bitter winter morning. I got up, took a lukewarm shower, and dressed meticulously. Dark gray wool trousers, closed-toe leather shoes, a thick turtleneck sweater, and my long black winter coat. I pulled my gray hair back into a tight bun, making sure not a single strand was out of place. I wanted to look immaculate, not to impress anyone, but as a suit of armor. Martha was already in the kitchen when I walked into the hallway. She had brewed strong, black coffee, no sugar, exactly how we needed it. She was dressed in a raincoat, her glasses hanging from her chest. "Manny just texted. The cab is waiting at the corner," Martha said, handing me a steaming mug. Her eyes gleamed with a fierce intensity, the intensity of someone about to witness divine justice delivered on earth. "We aren't going near the front door. I want to watch everything from the sidewalk across the street, by the Eucalyptus Plaza," I instructed, downing the coffee in 3 long gulps. We left the building at 6:30 a.m. The city was barely starting to stretch under a lead-colored sky. Manny's cab drove us in silence through the empty streets. When we turned onto the avenue connecting to my old neighborhood, the knot in my stomach vanished, replaced by an absolute, icy, clinical calm. Manny pulled the car over about 50 yards from the property, parking in front of the small neighborhood plaza, right behind a massive delivery truck that partially shielded us from view. "Right here is fine, Manny. Cut the engine and keep the meter running," I said, rolling my window halfway down to let in the cold air and the sounds of the street. It was 7:15 a.m. The residential street, usually bathed in the silence of manicured lawns and purebred dogs sleeping on porches, was in absolute chaos. Parked in front of the high brick walls of my old house were 3 massive dump trucks, their diesel engines rumbling, sending a deep vibration through the ground. Behind them, resting on a lowboy trailer, sat a monstrous yellow crawler excavator. Its jagged steel bucket was covered in dust and grease, ready to rip through walls. The amber emergency lights of the truck spun and flashed, painting the facades of the neighboring houses with pulsing reflections. Next to the heavy machinery sat 2 glossy black SUVs. 3 men and 1 woman had just stepped out of them. They were all wearing impeccable corporate suits, clutching leather folders under their arms, carrying an air of unquestionable authority. They were the lawyers for Horizon Development Group, accompanied by the site foreman and a notary public. They stood in front of the main gate of the house, checking their wristwatches with impatience, and right in the middle of all that deployed industrial and legal force was Richard. My son was pacing frantically back and forth on the sidewalk. He was wearing wrinkled gray sweatpants, a white t-shirt stained with coffee, and untied sneakers. The perfectly slicked back hair he had sported at the party was now a bird's nest, wrecked by panic and lack of sleep. He had his cell phone glued to his left ear, screaming desperate orders at whoever was on the other end of the line, while wildly gesturing with his right hand at the construction crew. The front gate of the house was wide open. The beautiful front yard, the one I had pruned on my hands and knees the week before, looked like a refugee camp. There were dozens of cardboard boxes, stacked haphazardly on the damp grass. designer lamps, hastily rolled up rugs, white leather armchairs draped in makeshift plastic covers, and appliances piled on top of each other completely blocked the driveway. Natalie, his wife, was standing on the porch. She was wrapped in a fake fur coat, shoving incredibly expensive pairs of shoes into heavy-duty black trash bags because they had run out of boxes. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her makeup smeared, her face swollen with rage. She screamed insults at Richard at the top of her lungs every time he walked near her. "You are useless, Richard! You told me you had this under control! You said it was a misunderstanding! My parents had to hire a tow truck to get their cars out last night because the movers took off." Natalie's screech cut through the street, echoing off the trees in the plaza. Mrs. Carmichael, my old neighbor, was sweeping the sidewalk in front of her house with exaggerated slowness. She didn't take her eyes off the spectacle for a second, absorbing every word, every tear, and every scream for the neighborhood gossip bulletin. Other neighbors were starting to peek out their windows, pulling back curtains or stepping out in their pajamas to grab the paper, drawn by the roar of the engines and the hysterical screaming of the perfect daughter-in-law. I watched the lead attorney for Horizon Development, a ruthless-looking woman with short hair and thick-rimmed glasses, walk over to Richard. She moved with the precision of a scalpel. She stopped in front of my son and spoke in a tone that, while not a shout, carried a cutting authority that reached all the way to my window. "Sir, it is 7:45 a.m. The grace period granted in the notarized eviction notice expires at 8 o'clock sharp. At that time, my crew will cut the padlocks, if any remain, move the heavy machinery onto the perimeter, and begin demolishing the exterior walls. Any personal property remaining on the lot or blocking the access path after that time will be classified as construction debris and destroyed along with the rubble. I strongly suggest you clear the sidewalk." Richard dropped his phone, letting his arm fall to his side. He stepped toward the woman with a pathetic aggression, invading her personal space in a desperate attempt at intimidation that only highlighted his absolute impotence. "You cannot do this." "I am a lawyer! I am a partner at the Montez law firm!" Richard bellowed, practically spitting in his desperation, losing every last trace of the aristocratic composure he had cultivated for so long. "That bill of sale is fraud! My mother is a senile old woman who didn't know what she was signing." "I filed for an injunction last night. A judge is going to stop this today. If a single machine touches those bricks, I will sue you for damages until you are bankrupt." The corporate lawyer didn't back up a single inch. She didn't even blink. She opened her leather folder, pulled out a printed document stamped with red seals, and handed it to Richard with the exact same coldness a cop hands a speeding ticket to a drunk driver. "The duty judge threw out your injunction at 3 in the morning, sir," the attorney said, a microscopic, lethal smile resting on her lips. The notary, Arthur Vance, attached 3 official psychiatric evaluations to the file, certifying the seller's full cognitive capacity. Furthermore, we have confirmation that the transaction funds are no longer in domestic jurisdiction, which invalidates any attempt at a preventative asset freeze on your part. Your mother left you zero room to maneuver, counselor. You have no legal standing regarding this property. Clear the sidewalk, or I will instruct the municipal police, who are currently en route, to arrest you for obstruction and disturbing the peace. Richard's face collapsed. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly, yellowish gray. He took the document with trembling hands, reading the printed lines as the glass world he had built on my back shattered into a million pieces right before his eyes. He stumbled backward, crashing into one of the cardboard boxes holding Natalie's French porcelain dinnerware. The box tipped over, and the sound of plates smashing against the pavement cracked like a gunshot through the street. Natalie let out a wail of pure fury. She threw the trash bag full of shoes on the ground and marched over to Richard, driving her index finger hard into his chest. "I married a fraud! A goddamn fraud who doesn't even own the dirt he's standing on! My parents are humiliated that my name is tied to this circus of starving beggars." She screamed right in his face, completely uncaring that the corporate lawyers, the construction crew, and half the neighborhood were watching the scene play out. Richard didn't fight back. He grabbed his head with both hands, pulling at his hair, spinning in circles like a cornered animal in a slaughterhouse, desperately looking for an exit that didn't exist. He looked out at the street. at the giant trucks waiting with their engines roaring, at the curious, judgmental stares of the neighbors he used to consider entirely beneath him. I opened the cab door. The cold morning air hit my face, but I felt absolutely invincible. "Wait for me here, Martha," I murmured, shutting the door softly. I walked down the plaza sidewalk and crossed the street slowly. My steps were firm and measured. I didn't rush. I didn't lower my head. My leather shoes clicked against the asphalt with a rhythmic, relentless cadence. Mrs. Carmichael saw me coming. She dropped her broom and slapped both hands over her mouth. The Horizon Development lawyer turned her head at the sound of my footsteps. She recognized me instantly from our previous meetings and took a step back, yielding the floor to me with a gesture of deep professional respect. I stopped 6 feet away from Richard. He was kneeling on the ground, fruitlessly trying to scoop up the broken pieces of porcelain with his bare hands, sobbing out of pure, unadulterated frustration. Natalie was the first to see me. She froze, her mouth hung half open, her breathing ragged, totally incapable of forming a single word in front of the woman she thought was just a maid, who had just erased her life of luxury with the stroke of a pen. Richard looked up when he noticed his wife's sudden silence. When his bloodshot eyes met mine, a flash of sick, desperate hope lit up his face. He scrambled to his feet clumsily, dropping the shards of porcelain, and took a step toward me with his hands reaching out, exactly like a little boy looking to hide behind his mother's skirt. "Mom! Oh my God, Mom, you're here!" he begged. His voice was broken, choking on snot and tears. "Please, tell them it's a mistake. Tell these lawyers it was a misunderstanding, that you were just mad, but everything is fixed now. Tell them you're canceling the sale. Mom, I'm begging you. Don't let them destroy the house. Don't let them throw my things in the street. They're going to fire me from the firm if the partners hear about this scandal. Natalie is going to leave me. Please, Mom, save me." I stood there looking at him in silence. I looked at his dirty clothes, his hunched posture, his dignity trampled into the public street in front of the entire neighborhood he had worked so hard to impress. I looked at the black trash bags stuffed with luxury goods. I looked at the perfect daughter-in-law, who now looked like a wax figure melting in the morning cold. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel compassion. The well was dry. I smoothed out the invisible wrinkles on my dark coat. It was the exact same gesture I had made with my kitchen apron 2 nights ago, when he condemned me to lockdown. I lifted my chin, holding his gaze with the coldness of a glacier, and I spoke. My voice did not tremble. It came out clear, sharp, and loud enough to be heard by the corporate lawyer, the truck operators, and the neighbors peering out of their windows. "Look at yourself, Richard," I said, gesturing with a slight nod of my head to the disaster surrounding him. "You are screaming in the middle of the street, surrounded by garbage bags, making a pathetic spectacle of yourself in front of these very important people." Richard blinked, completely confused, the tears freezing on his cheeks, still waiting for my words to be the prelude to a miraculous rescue. "Mom, I don't understand," he babbled, extending a shaking hand toward my arm. I took a step back, moving out of his reach, as if his touch physically repulsed me. I locked my eyes onto his and handed him back, syllable by syllable, the exact same rope he had tried to hang me with in the kitchen of my own home. "This kind of environment isn't for you, son." I pronounced the words slowly, with surgical precision, letting the echo of his own cruelty pierce his eardrums. "You are walking around out here in those dirty clothes with that desperate beggar attitude. You are embarrassing us, Richard. You are embarrassing your wife, your father's memory, and the entire neighborhood. I suggest you pick up your garbage bags and go hide in a corner somewhere until the workers have finished cleaning up your mess. Do not come out until everyone is gone." The impact of those exact phrases hit him with the physical force of a baseball bat to the stomach. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lungs emptied. His lawyer brain instantly recognized the perfect symmetry of his sentence. The ghost from the graduation hall, the submissive woman in the kitchen, and the bookbinder with the shredded hands had just fused together right in front of him into the shape of an untouchable executioner. He fell to his knees on the freezing pavement, totally incapable of holding up the weight of his own humiliation reflected in the mirror I had just held up to his face. Behind him, the neighborhood church clock struck 8 in the morning with a deep, heavy toll. The Horizon Development lawyer raised her hand in the air and gave a sharp signal to the crew. The deafening horn of the yellow excavator ripped through the morning air, announcing that time had run out. The metal tracks began to grind, chewing up the asphalt as the machine rolled forward, slow but unstoppable, heading straight for the exposed brick wall and the yard with the weeping willow. The roar of the engines completely drowned out my son's sobbing. I turned around, turning my back on the ruins of his life, and walked back to Manny's cab, letting the heavy machinery do the work of erasing forever everything that had once tied us together. The slam of Manny's cab door sounded with the finality of a gavel striking the block. A sharp crack that hermetically sealed the cabin, insulating me from the absolute chaos I had just unleashed. I settled into the back seat, feeling the rough texture of the cracked synthetic leather beneath my thighs and the scent of the artificial pine tree dangling from the rearview mirror. Manny didn't say a single word. With the discretion of a ghost, he shifted into drive with a smooth flick of his wrinkled hand and stepped on the gas. Behind me, the deafening roar of the yellow excavator completely swallowed Richard's choked wails and Natalie's hysterical screaming. I didn't turn my head. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead on the back of the driver's seat, but my ears, sharpened by the electric tension of the morning, registered every single second of the structural collapse. I heard the first metallic impact. It was a dull, thunderous boom. A deep vibration that traveled through the freezing asphalt, climbed up the cab's tires, and buzzed right through the soles of my orthopedic shoes. The jagged steel bucket had slammed head-on into the main wall. That same exposed brick wall I had power washed and scrubbed with a stiff bristled brush, summer after summer, to keep the facade looking immaculate. The impact was followed by a sickening crunch, the unmistakable sound of mortar giving way, of the foundation surrendering to the sheer brutality of industrial force. Then, the roar of rubble cascading onto the damp lawn, crushing the antique rose bushes that had cost me so much blood. Martha, sitting right next to me, slid her hand over mine. Her fingers were cold from the morning air, but her grip was rock solid, transmitting a silent solidarity that didn't need any dressing up. I glanced out the side window as the car rolled slowly forward. The residential street, normally a sanctuary of silence, with its wrought iron street lamps and pristine mailboxes, was falling behind, swallowed by a dense cloud of grayish dust. The dust swirled in the wind, coating the cardboard boxes stacked on the sidewalk, dirtying the coats of the corporate lawyers, and burying forever the facade of arrogance my son had tried to build on my back. The drive back to downtown unfolded in a silence that had weight, texture, and temperature. It was a clean silence, completely stripped of guilt, the kind of silence that follows the amputation of a gangrenous limb. When we pulled up to the red brick building where my friend lived, I paid Manny with a large bill I pulled from the bottom of my purse. He took it, gave me a nod, touching the brim of his worn wool cap, and murmured "Have a very good life, Miss Josephine." That sounded like a final blessing. We walked up the building's stairs. Every step reminded me of the exhaustion pooled in my knee joints, but it was a different kind of fatigue. It was no longer the crushing exhaustion of submission or the burden of having to please a domestic tyrant. It was the physical tiredness of a battle fought and won. When I walked into the small apartment, the smell of the black coffee Martha had brewed before dawn was still hanging in the air, mixing with the scent of floor wax. I took off my dark coat, hung it on the wooden rack by the door, and walked straight into the bathroom. I needed to wash my face. I turned on the faucet, let the freezing water run until the metal fogged up, and splashed my face, scrubbing my cheeks hard. I looked at myself in the damp spotted mirror. The wrinkles were still there. The deep trenches around my mouth hadn't magically disappeared, but the frightened, accommodating look of the cornered widow had vanished completely. Staring back at me was a woman who had finally learned how to use the fire to her advantage, instead of letting herself burn to ashes. Weeks passed. Winter settled into the city with an icy breath, coating the mornings in white frost and forcing people on the street to walk hunched over under thick wool scarves and dark umbrellas. For me, however, those days were the warmest and brightest I could remember in 4 decades. I stayed in Martha's guest room for the first month, organizing my new existence with the methodical precision of a watchmaker adjusting the gears of a flawless machine. One Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Arthur Vance called me into his office, to finalize the banking paperwork. The office smelled, as always, of pipe tobacco, ink pads, and old leather. I sat across from his massive desk, crossing my legs, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater I had bought the day before at a downtown boutique, my first personal luxury since I could remember. Arthur closed a thick cardboard folder, initialed the final page with his fountain pen, took off his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose with a look of deep professional satisfaction. "The trust is operating flawlessly, Josie," he informed me, resting his elbows on the mahogany desk. "Miss Valerie Rivers confirmed for me this morning that the funds are completely bulletproof and generating interest in the offshore account. Legally speaking, you are a financial ghost. You are officially untouchable." I nodded slowly, watching the pale afternoon light bleed through the wooden blinds of his window. Arthur picked up his unlit pipe from the crystal ashtray and looked right at me. "I assume you want to know how your son's little street performance ended," he said. His tone was neutral, but it couldn't entirely hide his disdain for the malpractice of young attorneys. I hadn't asked. I hadn't called to check in, nor had I sent anyone to snoop around. But human curiosity is an instinct that is very hard to kill completely. I gave a microscopic nod. Arthur leaned back in his swivel chair, which creaked under his weight. The public meltdown in front of the bulldozers was just the prelude to the disaster, the estate attorney began, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. "Mr. Ignatius Montes, the founding partner of the firm where your son worked, is a man obsessed with corporate reputation. Word of the forced eviction, the erratic behavior, and Richard's hysterical screaming in the public street reached his ears before noon. Worse still, Natalie's parents, humiliated to their core by having to tow their imported cars out of there in front of half the neighborhood, and by witnessing Horizon Development crush their son-in-law's little theater, took immediate, lethal action." Arthur paused, drumming his fingers against the polished wood, savoring the poetic justice of the facts. "Natalie's father pulled every single account and contract belonging to his construction company from the Montes law firm that exact same morning. He was one of their heaviest hitters, a financial pillar of the firm. Montes went absolutely ballistic. He called Richard into his office at exactly 2 p.m. He fired him on the spot, right in front of the other junior partners. He ordered him to empty his desk into a cardboard box and had him escorted out of the building by private security. They didn't even give him the courtesy of drafting a resignation letter to save face. They threw him out into the street like a rabid dog. I listened to every word without changing my expression. I didn't smile. I didn't feel any sadistic joy or overwhelming triumph. Richard's downfall was simply the mathematical consequence of his own decisions. A collapse caused by the exact same rotten foundation he had chosen to build on, ignoring the blood and sweat of the person holding up the beams. "And his wife?" I asked, adjusting the crease of my trousers with my fingertips. "Natalie filed for divorce 3 days after the house was demolished," Arthur replied, flipping to a secondary document on his desk. "She cited emotional distress, financial deception, and public humiliation. Since Richard had blown almost all his liquid savings on remodeling your backyard and throwing that absurd party to impress the partners, he was left with zero operating funds. She kept both imported cars, drained the joint accounts, and moved back in with her parents. Your son, in a fit of total desperation, tried to file a criminal lawsuit against me, against you, and against the developers, alleging procedural fraud. But not a single judge in the city would docket the case. The medical evidence we submitted was ironclad. In the end, the Bar Association sent him a formal warning for frivolous litigation. If he keeps trying to sue the firm without legal grounds, they will suspend his license indefinitely. He is tied hand and foot." Hand quote. I walked out of Arthur Vance's office with a light step. The biting air of the street filled my lungs, sweeping away any lingering residue of oppression. I never asked about Richard again. His name stopped being spoken in my daily conversations. The massive space he used to occupy in my mind, a space that for decades had been crammed with worries, forced justifications, and the constant suffocating fear of disappointing him, was now completely empty, ready to be furnished with my own desires and my own rules. And furnishing it was exactly what I did. I dedicated myself to hunting for a new home with the patience of someone who is in no rush to get anywhere. I didn't want a house with a yard. I I didn't want roses to prune on my hands and knees, or a giant weeping willow that would remind me of the past, or long hallways to sweep. I wanted height, natural light, and glass. Halfway through the second month, I found exactly what I was looking for. Up on the ninth floor of a modern architectural building, located directly across from the city's main botanical garden, just 10 blocks from Martha's apartment. It was a corner unit, spacious but easy to maintain. It had massive floor-to-ceiling windows with black aluminum frames, offering an uninterrupted panoramic view of the treetops and the jagged skyline of the skyscrapers. The floors were light maple wood, polished until they looked like a mirror of solid water. The walls were painted in immaculate white that caught and multiplied the sunlight from dawn until dusk. When the real estate agent handed me the heavy ring of keys, right after I signed the cash purchase deed at the notary's office, I stood alone in the middle of the empty living room. I walked barefoot across the cold wood, feeling the smooth texture against the soles of my feet. The echo of my footsteps sounded different here than in my old property. There were no ghosts of the past here. No memories of gambling debts, no echoes of cruel orders barked in the kitchen. Here, there was only clean air and the future. The process of moving in was slow, deliberate, and deeply pleasurable. I brought absolutely nothing from my previous life. Everything that came through the door of that ninth floor apartment was completely new, chosen meticulously by me, paid for with the black card from the trust. I bought a wide sofa upholstered in sand-colored linen, so soft and deep it practically begged you to fall asleep on it during rainy afternoons. Instead of a heavy, solid oak table for 12 that I would never use and that only served to gather dust, I put a small, round tempered glass and polished stainless steel table in the corner by the window, paired with 2 ergonomic chairs upholstered in white leather. I bought 1,000 thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets for my bed, thick alpaca wool blankets, and goose-down pillows that sank the second you touched them. I filled the kitchen with whisper-quiet, state-of-the-art appliances and bought artisanal ceramic dishes, unique, irregular pieces, hand-glazed in shades of turquoise and pure white. I set aside the smallest room, the one that caught the golden, slanting light of the late afternoon, for a very specific purpose. It wasn't going to be a guest room for visitors I didn't want, nor a storage closet to hoard useless junk. I custom-ordered a solid ashwood workbench, adjusted to the exact height of my elbows so I wouldn't strain my neck. I bought top-of-the-line bookbinding tools I used to only see in import catalogs, perfectly polished oxbone folders, high-carbon steel awls with ergonomic olive wood handles, spools of brilliant, natural silk thread, smooth-action cast-iron book presses, and whole sheets of genuine Italian leather that smelled of fine tanning. I was no longer going to bind dusty legal encyclopedias or filthy criminal dossiers just to survive. Now I would bind blank journals, classic poetry books, and botanical photo albums, purely and exclusively for the aesthetic pleasure of feeling the thick paper beneath my fingers, to create something tangible and beautiful without the suffocating pressure of the clock or the shadow of hunger. One Sunday morning, exactly 6 months after the final collapse of the exposed brick house, Martha came over to my apartment for breakfast. I had brewed dark coffee in my new machine, its low hum barely interrupting the absolute silence of the ninth floor, and I had baked cheese bread in the electric oven. We sat at the glass table by the window. The massive park below was a bright green carpet, swaying in the spring wind, dotted by the vivid colors of the morning joggers. Martha took a long sip from her turquoise ceramic mug, closed her eyes to appreciate the intense flavor of the freshly ground beans, and then looked at me over the rim of the cup. She had that spark of endless conspiracy in her eyes, a spark that all the years and disappointments hadn't managed to put out. I went to the pharmacy at the strip mall yesterday afternoon to pick up my blood pressure pills, Martha said, spreading butter onto a warm piece of bread with a silver knife. I ran into Mrs. Carmichael in line. Seems the poor woman is bored to tears without having your old house next door to spy on over the vines. So now she dedicates her time to tracking people down on social media and interrogating the neighborhood. I didn't say anything. I just blew on the steam rising from my coffee, leaning back against my chair, waiting for her to continue at her own pace. She told me she saw your son a couple of days ago. Martha finally dropped, lowering her voice a little, as if the wind beating against the glass might overhear us. Well, not in person. Carmen's nephew saw him. He works down at the civil courthouses. Richard is working as a second-tier administrative clerk for a public defender. It's a tiny, hole-in-the-wall office down in a basement. The kind of place that smells like old pipes, dampness, and despair. The kid says he saw him standing in line at the court notification window, carrying a stack of ragged case files under his arm in the pouring rain. He was wearing a gray suit that was too big for him, shiny at the elbows from wear and tear, and shoes with soles ground down from walking the pavement. The kid said he looked aged, dark circles under his eyes, hunched over from the weight of the files. He kept his eyes glued to the floor the whole time he waited in line, like he was absolutely terrified someone from his old luxury life might recognize him in all that misery. I stared out the window at the lush treetops. The mental image of Richard, violently stripped of his tailored suits, his $1,000 watch, his trophy wife, and his unbearable arrogance, standing in line like a lowly errand boy in the gloomy basements of the judicial system he thought he ruled from above, drew itself in my mind with photographic clarity. I felt absolutely zero urge to rescue him. That blind maternal instinct that, in the past, would have pushed me to run to him with a hot plate of food, a wad of blood-stained cash, and cheap words of comfort, had been ripped out by the roots. Cauterized forever in that guest bathroom. He had ordered, with a firm voice, that the old maid who embarrassed him vanish from his sight. The maid vanished, and she took the mother, the meat shield, and the life support system of his existence with her. The world is a remarkably cruel mirror when you are forced to look at yourself in it without the filter of someone else's money, I murmured, picking up a piece of cheese bread and bringing it to my mouth. I hope he learns how to clean up his own dirt, because there is no one left to run a rag over it for him. Martha nodded in silence, changing the subject with the enviable ease of someone closing a book they've lost interest in reading. We talked about the new historical novel she was reading, about caring for her indoor plants, and about the very real possibility of taking a trip together to the warm coast before the summer ended. The morning drifted by, unhurried, marked by occasional laughter, wrapped in that unbreakable peace you only achieve when you take a sharp knife and cut the rope tying you to a lead anchor at the bottom of the sea. When Martha said goodbye and left just past noon, I was completely alone in the apartment. The afternoon sun began its descent, bathing the living room in a thick, warm, golden light, casting long, elegant shadows across the maple wood. I went to the kitchen, washed the 2 turquoise ceramic mugs under the warm tap, and dried them meticulously with a clean linen cloth. My hands, permanently marked by the scars of pure bleach, the burns of boiling glue, and the deep cuts of hemp thread, now moved with a relaxed slowness, free of the sharp pain that used to wake me up in the middle of the night. I walked slowly into my workroom. Resting on the solid ashwood table was my latest personal project, a thick journal made of cold-pressed cotton paper, hand-stitched with ivory silk thread, using an exposed chain binding. The covers were wrapped in midnight blue leather, soft to the touch, flexible, yet incredibly resilient. I sat in the ergonomic chair, adjusted the articulated arm of the desk lamp so it cast light directly onto the dead center of the table, and opened the first drawer on the right. There, nestled carefully between precision steel tools and small jars of natural beeswax, sat the dark blue velvet case. The exact same worn-edged case that more than 10 years ago had held the expensive, gold-plated fountain pen Richard never wanted to accept because my presence at his graduation embarrassed him. I pulled it out of the drawer. The rough velvet brushed against my fingertips, but the contact no longer triggered any painful memories, no tightness in my chest. The memory had lost its fangs. The venom had evaporated. I opened the case with a soft click of the metal hinge. Inside, there was no longer any room for absences, for lies invented in front of law firm partners, or for a son's disdain. The satin-lined cavity was occupied by an entirely new object. I pulled out my reading glasses. They were thin, elegant glasses, with a gold titanium frame that I had custom-ordered from a boutique optician the week before. They were impossibly light, perfect, made to the exact prescription of my tired eyes. I placed them on the bridge of my nose, hooking the frames behind my ears. The world around me snapped into focus immediately, with absolute resounding clarity. The polished edges of the wooden table, the porous texture of the midnight blue leather of my binding, the the tiny specks of dust dancing, suspended in the beam of sunlight pouring through the window. Everything became clear, defined, undeniable. I picked up a fine-tipped black ink pen. I opened the leather journal to the first immaculate white page. I smoothed the cotton paper with the open palm of my right hand, and, under the protective, absolute silence of a home that was entirely and exclusively mine, I began to write my own story.